My grandparents were the kind of people who believed in quiet resilience and careful planning. They didn't live lavishly, but they valued education above all else. Knowledge is the one thing no one can ever steal from you, my grandmother used to say. It's painfully ironic now. They lived in another state, so I only saw them a couple of times a year, but they never missed a chance to celebrate my milestones. Every card they sent me had handwritten advice, little notes about life, and small checks labeled for my education fund. I never thought much about it. It felt like one of those distant future things, not real until I needed it. My grandfather passed away 5 years ago after a short illness, and my grandmother followed 2 years later. Losing her was harder than I'd expected. She was the glue that held everything together, even from afar. On the day she died, I sat on my couch and reread every letter she'd sent me, grateful for her love and wisdom. I had no idea, sitting there, that she and my grandfather had been planning something far greater for my future. When their will was read, it felt like they had seen me more clearly than anyone else ever had. My parents inherited their savings and the family home. My sister, Vanessa, received my grandmother's jewelry, pieces worth tens of thousands of dollars. And then there was me. I was left $85,000, specifically earmarked for my MBA. The will was clear. The money was not to be touched for any reason other than my education. My parents were named trustees of the fund until I needed it. At the time, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. It felt like my grandparents had carved out a space for me, recognizing my ambitions and dreams in a way my parents never had. My dad dismissed it with a casual, "Well, you won't need this for a while anyway." My mom added something about how they were proud of me, though her tone made it sound like an obligation rather than genuine pride. Looking back, I should have been more cautious. Vanessa had always been their favorite, and I mean always. While I excelled in school, won awards, and graduated at the top of my class, Vanessa could announce she was thinking of taking a yoga class, and they'd throw a family dinner in her honor. She dropped out of college twice, worked a string of short-term jobs, and finally landed as an assistant at a daycare. To her credit, she seemed happy, but our parents treated her like she was on the verge of discovering the cure for cancer. Meanwhile, I'd spent years building a career I was proud of. I worked my way up to a managerial position at a mid-sized tech company, leading a team of 15 and managing million-dollar accounts. My MBA was the next logical step, a way to break into executive leadership and continue growing. I had been researching programs for years and was finally ready to start applying. About a month ago, during a quiet evening at my parents' house, I brought up the fund. I explained that application fees for top-tier MBA programs were steep, and I wanted to budget properly. My dad gave me this strange look, like I just asked him for his retirement savings. "Let's not worry about that right now," he said, shifting in his chair. My mom jumped in, her tone overly bright. "Focus on your applications first, honey. We'll talk about the fund later." They changed the subject so quickly it left me reeling. Within minutes, they were gushing about Vanessa and her husband-to-be, Todd, and how they'd been looking at houses. Apparently, the real estate market was brutal, and Vanessa was so close to finding her dream home if only she had a little more support. I tried to ignore the unease in my stomach. Maybe they were just bad at managing details, I told myself. Maybe they'd lost track of the paperwork or weren't ready to discuss finances yet. But something didn't sit right. A week later, I brought it up again, this time more directly. I told them I needed to know how much was available so I could plan properly. That's when my mom dropped the bomb. "We used the money to help Vanessa and Todd buy a house," she said, as casually as if she were telling me she'd used the last of the milk. I froze. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. My dad didn't look up from the table. "They needed it more than you do," he muttered. "You've always been good with money. You can take out loans like everyone else." I stared at them, trying to process the words. This wasn't just thoughtless. It was betrayal. "That money was for my MBA," I said, louder than I intended. Grandma and Grandpa made it clear. My mom waved her hand dismissively. "You're smart. You'll figure it out. Besides, Vanessa and Todd needed a down payment. It's not fair for one child to get so much help while the other struggles." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It wasn't your money to give away." I shouted, years of frustration bubbling to the surface. Do you even realize what you've done? My dad finally looked up, his face hard. You're overreacting, he said. You're acting like we ruined your life. It's not like you can't still get your MBA. You just have to work a little harder, that's all. I was shaking by this point, unable to hold back the tears. It's illegal, I said. You stole from me. That's when they laughed. Not an awkward chuckle, but a full, dismissive laugh. My mom smirked. Go ahead, she said. Call a lawyer. With what money? It was like the ground had disappeared beneath me. I left their house that night feeling hollow and angry in a way I'd never experienced before. My grandparents had trusted them to protect my future, and they'd thrown it away like it was nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard their laughter, echoing in my head. The morning after that conversation, I woke up with a pounding headache and a deep sense of betrayal that refused to fade. My grandparents had worked their entire lives to leave something meaningful for me, and my parents had treated it like pocket change. Worse, they didn't even seem to care. At work, I couldn't focus. My boss, Mr. Harper, noticed something was off during our weekly check-in. He's always been a mentor to me, someone who believed in my potential even when I doubted myself. I hesitated, but eventually, I spilled everything. His reaction was immediate. That's not just wrong. It's criminal, he said, leaning back in his chair. They violated their fiduciary duty. You need to speak with someone who knows estate law. I hadn't even thought about the legal side of it. The idea of taking my parents to court felt overwhelming, but Mr. Harper's words stuck with me. That evening, I called my uncle, Daniel, my dad's cousin. He's a successful entrepreneur who always seemed to see through my parents' favoritism. While he wasn't particularly close to them, he'd been quietly supportive of me over the years, often checking in to see how I was doing. When I told him what had happened, there was a long pause. Then he said, I always knew your parents played favorites, but this crosses every line. He didn't mince words. Get a lawyer. I'll cover the costs. True to his word, Daniel didn't waste time. By the next morning, he had put me in touch with a legal team specializing in estate law. During our first meeting, they confirmed what I already suspected. My parents' actions were not only unethical but outright illegal. The terms of the will were crystal clear. The money was to be used exclusively for my MBA, and as trustees, my parents were obligated to safeguard it. Their decision to divert the funds to Vanessa and Todd's house wasn't just a betrayal, it was embezzlement. The lawyers also connected me with a forensic accountant who could track every dollar taken from the account. Within a week, they had compiled a detailed report showing that my parents had started transferring money to Vanessa's account nearly a year before my grandmother passed away. Small, regular withdrawals had gradually drained the fund, with the final, massive transfer occurring just before the house purchase. When the evidence was presented to me, I felt a mix of anger and validation. It wasn't just a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated betrayal that had been going on for months. Daniel wasn't done yet. He suggested we bring in a private investigator to look into the rest of my parents' financial activities. If they were willing to steal from you, he said, who knows what else they've done? The investigation uncovered more than I expected. My parents had used their power of attorney over my grandmother's finances to access other accounts before her death. They had sold small family heirlooms and dipped into savings meant to cover her medical expenses, using the money to fund Vanessa and Todd's wedding and even a few renovations on their own house. Meanwhile, my parents had no idea what was coming. They must have thought I'd let it go, that I'd swallow my anger like I had so many times before. Instead, they were blindsided when they were served legal papers at their doorstep. The backlash was immediate. My mom called me, leaving a voicemail dripping with disbelief and anger. How could you do this to your own family? She said. You're dragging our name through the mud for no reason. We were just trying to help Vanessa, and you're acting like we're criminals. My dad's email was no better. He accused me of being ungrateful and selfish, insisting they'd plan to help me eventually, once Vanessa and Todd were stable. He ended with a chilling line. You've destroyed this family. I forwarded both messages to Daniel's legal team without responding. They advised me not to engage and to let them handle all communication. Don't give them the chance to manipulate you, one of the lawyers said. They're counting on you to back down. Vanessa, on the other hand, took a different approach. She sent me a long, rambling email, claiming she had no idea the money was meant for my MBA. Mom and Dad said it was a gift they'd been saving for years, she wrote. I would never have taken it if I'd known the truth. She begged me to drop the case, saying it was tearing the family apart. Her words might have carried more weight if they weren't immediately followed by a defensive justification. You don't need the money right now, she wrote. You've always been so independent and successful. I didn't think it would matter. It mattered. I forwarded her email to the legal team, who confirmed that while she might not have orchestrated the theft, she was still complicit by accepting the stolen funds. The house Vanessa and Todd had purchased with my MBA money was now flagged in the court case, and the mortgage lender launched its own investigation. The first court hearing was surreal. My parents' lawyer tried to argue that they'd acted in good faith, thinking they were making a family-oriented decision. The judge wasn't buying it. She pointed out that the will explicitly stated the money was for my education and that their role as trustees required them to act in my best interest, not Vanessa's. The evidence was damning. The forensic report, the investigator's findings, and even emails between my parents and Vanessa painted a clear picture of deliberate misconduct. The judge granted an injunction to freeze their remaining assets while the case continued, ensuring they couldn't hide or spend anything else. Leaving the courtroom that day, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing I was finally standing up for myself, but there was also an ache I couldn't ignore. These were my parents. They were supposed to protect me, not betray me. But as Daniel reminded me later, family doesn't excuse theft. They made their choices. Now they have to live with them. For the first time, I started to believe he was right. The weeks following the first court hearing were intense. My parents, who had once laughed at the idea of me taking legal action, were now scrambling to defend themselves. The evidence was overwhelming, and their lawyers seemed increasingly frazzled with each new development. Meanwhile, Daniel's legal team was relentless, building a case so airtight that even their attempts at excuses fell flat. The forensic accountant's findings continued to uncover just how methodical my parents' betrayal had been. They hadn't simply diverted the money in one impulsive decision. It was a calculated, months-long scheme. Small withdrawals had been masked as family expenses, and larger sums had been disguised as gifts to Vanessa and Todd. The meticulous paper trail left little room for interpretation, and the court's patience with their excuses was wearing thin. Vanessa and Todd's dream house was quickly becoming their biggest nightmare. The mortgage lender froze their account when the court flagged the stolen money used for the down payment. This triggered an internal investigation, and it turned out my parents had falsified financial documents to make the deal happen. Vanessa sent me another email, her tone shifting from pleading to angry. I didn't know about the money, she insisted again, before accusing me of ruining her life. According to her, the fallout from the investigation had made her a pariah in her neighborhood, with neighbors whispering about her financial scandal. Todd, she added bitterly, was furious and blaming her for trusting our parents. She ended with, I hope you're happy with what you've done to us. I forwarded her email to Daniel's team and moved on. I didn't owe Vanessa an explanation or an apology. She had benefited from money that wasn't hers, and no amount of deflection would change that. By this point, my parents' situation was spiraling. The court ordered a second round of depositions, and their lawyer could barely keep up. Every time he tried to shift blame or downplay their actions, the evidence from the forensic accountant countered him. At one point, when pressed about why they hadn't consulted me before touching the education fund, my dad snapped. We didn't think she'd care so much. She's always been independent. It was such a bizarre response that even their lawyer looked stunned. My mom, meanwhile, stayed silent, her face tight with frustration. She finally spoke up to claim they had misunderstood the will, but when the judge pointed out how clear the terms were, she fell back into defensive silence. Vanessa and Todd's involvement added another layer of chaos. Their attorney had advised them to distance themselves from my parents, which created a noticeable rift. Todd outright refused to attend family meetings, and Vanessa, while still trying to protect herself, began blaming my parents for the situation. From what I heard, She had hired her own lawyer to handle the mortgage investigation and was considering trying to return some of the money, though by then, it was too late to undo the damage. The private investigator Daniel hired uncovered something even more shocking. My parents had been dipping into other family accounts long before my grandparents' deaths. They had accessed savings meant for my grandmother's healthcare expenses and even sold off heirlooms without consulting the family. One of these sales included a necklace that had been in the family for generations, something my grandmother had explicitly mentioned wanting to pass down. When the investigator brought this to light, it sparked outrage among our extended family. My parents had spent months telling relatives that I had willingly given up the MBA fund to help Vanessa and Todd. Emails surfaced, showing my mom crafting messages to cousins and aunts, painting me as the selfless, supportive daughter who had put family first. The lies unraveled quickly when Daniel shared the real story. At this point, my parents' social and professional lives were crumbling. My dad, who had built his career on trust and reputation, was quietly asked to retire early. His company didn't want the legal scandal attached to his name, and former colleagues began distancing themselves. My mom, who thrived on being a social butterfly in her community, found herself iced out of the clubs and events she had once dominated. Even their church, which they had attended for decades, held a private meeting to discuss their continued involvement. Within a week, they were asked to step down from all leadership roles. Vanessa's situation wasn't much better. The daycare where she worked called an emergency board meeting to discuss her ethical judgment. Within days, she was placed on administrative leave, pending a review. Parents at the school, many of whom had heard about the scandal, began questioning her ability to lead, and the rumors spread like wildfire. Todd, who had initially stayed silent, finally had enough. He moved out of their apartment, leaving a note that said, "I can't deal with this anymore." From what mutual acquaintances told me, he was furious at Vanessa for not being honest about the source of the money and felt blindsided by the legal consequences. Their engagement officially ended a week later. Despite everything, my parents kept trying to spin the narrative. They sent messages to extended family, framing themselves as victims of my unnecessary legal action. They claimed they had made a mistake out of love for their family and that I was being cruel by refusing to forgive them. A few relatives, initially swayed by their version of events, reached out to me with concern. But when Daniel's team shared the evidence, most of them quickly changed their tune. The second court hearing was a turning point. The judge, visibly frustrated with my parents' repeated attempts to shift blame, made it clear that their actions had been deliberate and premeditated. She noted that their continued attempts to manipulate the narrative only demonstrated their lack of remorse. When I left the courtroom that day, I felt lighter. There was still more to do, but for the first time, I truly believed justice was on my side. My parents had spent years treating me like an afterthought, but now they couldn't ignore me. They couldn't rewrite the story. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The fallout from the second court hearing hit my parents hard. The judge's clear disapproval of their actions sent shockwaves through the family, and their lawyers seemed to be barely holding the case together. The once confident front my parents had maintained was gone, replaced by a visible desperation. Every new piece of evidence chipped away at their credibility, and the legal pressure was mounting. Meanwhile, Vanessa's world was collapsing just as quickly. The daycare's board didn't wait long to make their decision. They terminated her contract, citing concerns about professional integrity. Parents in the community had started pulling their kids from the daycare, and the bad publicity was too much for the school to ignore. Vanessa, who had always been praised for her charm and warmth, found herself alienated from the very community that used to adore her. Todd, now completely estranged, had moved back in with his parents. He wasn't taking Vanessa's calls, and mutual friends said he was furious about being dragged into the scandal. The failed mortgage deal had not only cost them the house but had also flagged both of them in the banking system, making it nearly impossible for either to secure another loan anytime soon. From what I heard, Todd blamed Vanessa for trusting our parents, and Vanessa blamed everyone else. Back in court, my parents' new lawyer, their third one since the case began, was trying to negotiate a settlement. They offered to pay back a portion of the stolen money over several years, claiming they simply didn't have the means to repay the full amount immediately. Daniel's legal team shut it down without hesitation. "This isn't negotiable," they said firmly. "Every penny must be returned with interest, along with legal fees." The court agreed, and the financial strain on my parents became unbearable. The house they'd inherited from my grandparents had already been sold, but it wasn't enough to cover the judgment. They were forced to liquidate more assets: my mom's jewelry collection, my dad's prized car, and even family heirlooms they hadn't yet touched. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. My grandparents had built that home and accumulated those assets with the intention of creating a legacy for their family. Now, everything was gone, thanks to my parents' greed and deceit. My parents tried to appeal to me again, this time through mutual acquaintances and extended family. One of my cousins forwarded me a message from my mom, where she claimed they were deeply sorry and wanted to meet face-to-face to make things right. Another cousin called me directly, saying, "They're struggling, you know. Maybe it's time to let this go." But every attempt at reconciliation felt hollow. My parents weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry for the consequences. They didn't care about the betrayal. They cared about their reputation and comfort. I ignored every message and let Daniel's team handle it. The next major blow came when the private investigator uncovered recordings of my grandmother's conversations with her caregiver in the months leading up to her death. In these recordings, my grandmother spoke directly about the education fund, expressing her desire for it to remain untouched until I needed it. She mentioned concerns about my parents' judgment, saying, "I trust they'll do the right thing, but sometimes I worry they prioritize Vanessa too much." When this evidence was presented in court, my parents' lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. My mom actually broke down, sobbing as the recording played. "We didn't mean for it to get this bad," she said in a trembling voice. But the judge was unmoved, noting that their actions were not only deliberate but spanned months of calculated deception. The judge issued a final order for full repayment within 90 days, along with an additional fine for punitive damages. She also required my parents to cover the costs of the forensic investigation and all legal fees. It was a financial death sentence. They would have to sell everything they owned just to break even, leaving them with nothing. The fallout extended beyond the court. Word of the case spread throughout their social circle, and their remaining friends began to distance themselves. My dad, who had once been respected in his professional field, found that no one wanted to associate with him anymore. Networking events, business meetings, and even casual lunches were suddenly off the table. My mom's social life dried up entirely. She was quietly removed from every committee, club, and organization she had once dominated. Even their church, which they had attended faithfully for decades, held a meeting to address the scandal. Within a week, my parents were asked to step down from all leadership roles and eventually stopped attending altogether. Vanessa, meanwhile, had moved back in with our parents, though their relationship was far from harmonious. She blamed them for everything: her job loss, her ruined reputation, and the collapse of her engagement. My parents, in turn, resented her for not standing by them in court. From what I heard, their arguments became so frequent and loud that the neighbors started complaining. For me, life was starting to look up. My acceptance into a prestigious MBA program was finalized, and I began preparing to move to a new city. The program offered a merit scholarship that covered part of the tuition, and the court-ordered repayment of my education fund meant I could cover the rest without taking on debt. Daniel continued to be an incredible source of support. He introduced me to his business network, opening doors I never thought I'd have access to. "Your grandparents would be proud of you," he said one evening over dinner. "Not just because of what you've accomplished, but because of how you stood up for yourself." As I packed up my apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come since that awful night at my parents' house. The hurt was still there, but it no longer defined me. I was moving forward, ready to build a life on my terms. My parents might have thought they could erase my future to prop up Vanessa's, but they were wrong. In trying to take everything from me, they only ended up losing it all themselves. The next few months were a whirlwind of change. With the court's final ruling in place, my parents were left scrambling to meet their financial obligations. The sale of their house had already covered a significant portion of the repayment, but it wasn't enough. They began selling everything else they could, from furniture to collectibles, desperately trying to avoid the prospect of complete bankruptcy. I learned through mutual acquaintances that they had moved into a small apartment in a less desirable part of town. It wasn't just the downgrade in lifestyle that hit them hard. It was the complete loss of their social standing. My dad, who had once been a respected figure in his industry, was now avoided like the plague. My mom, who thrived on her community roles and social connections, was met with cold shoulders and forced smiles wherever she went. The few friends who still spoke to her did so out of pity, not loyalty. Vanessa didn't fare much better. Living with our parents only deepened the cracks in their relationship. From what I heard, the constant blame-shifting and arguments made their apartment unbearable. Vanessa had tried to salvage her career by applying for teaching positions, but word of her involvement in the financial scandal followed her wherever she went. Schools didn't want the risk of hiring someone whose ethics were now in question. Todd's departure from her life had been the final straw. He had cut ties completely, and from what mutual friends said, he was relieved to be free of the chaos. Vanessa sent me one last email, dripping with bitterness. She claimed I had ruined her life, calling me selfish for not letting it go. Family should come first, she wrote, as though she hadn't been the one to benefit from my stolen future. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. While my parents and Vanessa were busy drowning in the consequences of their choices, I was finally starting to breathe. My move to a new city for the MBA program felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. The scholarship I had earned, combined with the returned education fund, meant I could focus entirely on my studies without financial stress. My new apartment was in a quiet, gated community, a far cry from the chaos I'd left behind. Daniel had helped me find the place, insisting on security measures to ensure I wouldn't have to deal with any surprise visits from my parents. He even had their photos given to the building's management with strict instructions to deny them entry if they ever showed up. At school, I threw myself into the work. The MBA program was challenging, but it felt like exactly where I was meant to be. My professors were inspiring, and my classmates were a mix of ambitious, driven people who motivated me to push myself further. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of just surviving. Daniel remained a steady presence in my life, checking in regularly and introducing me to his professional network. He'd become more than just a mentor. He was family in the truest sense of the word. One evening, over dinner, he shared something that stuck with me. Your grandparents always saw something special in you, he said. That's why they set up the fund the way they did. They knew you'd use it to create something meaningful. Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. I had spent so long feeling like the forgotten daughter, overshadowed by Vanessa, that I hadn't fully appreciated how much my grandparents had believed in me. Their faith in me was what had carried me through this ordeal, and I was determined to honor their legacy by succeeding on my own terms. The fallout from my parents continued to spiral. A few weeks after the court's final ruling, I received an anonymous letter from someone in their former social circle. It was short but telling. Your parents are barely seen these days, it read. Your mom only leaves the apartment for groceries, and your dad sits alone at a diner every morning, staring out the window. They used to talk about how proud they were of their family. Now, they don't talk to anyone. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had spent years building their identity around appearances, being the perfect family, raising the perfect children, living the perfect life. Now, they had nothing left but each other, and even that seemed tenuous at best. Vanessa eventually moved out, though I didn't bother to find out where she went. The last I heard, she was staying with a friend and trying to piece her life back together. My parents, meanwhile, remained in their self-imposed exile, avoiding the very community they once thrived in. Despite everything, there was still a small part of me that mourned the loss of my family. I hadn't wanted it to end this way, but every time I thought about reaching out, I remembered their laughter that night. The way they had dismissed my dreams as though they were nothing. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. For me, life kept moving forward. My professors took notice of my hard work, and one of them even recommended me for an internship with a major company. Mr. Harper, my former boss, stayed in touch and made it clear that a leadership role would be waiting for me when I finished my degree. You've shown the kind of strength and integrity we need in this business, he said during one of our calls. The future felt brighter than it ever had before. My parents' betrayal had been devastating, but it had also taught me something invaluable. I didn't need their approval or support to succeed. Everything I needed, I already had within me. As I prepared for the final stretch of my MBA program, I found myself thinking often about my grandparents. Their belief in hard work, resilience, and education had shaped so much of who I was. They had seen my potential long before I did, and now I was finally living up to it. I wasn't sure if I'd ever reconnect with my parents or Vanessa, but for the first time, I was at peace with that uncertainty. My focus was on the life I was building, one that was mine and mine alone. As I entered my final year of the MBA program, life felt like it was finally falling into place. The endless late nights of studying and project deadlines were exhausting, but they were the kind of challenges I'd chosen for myself, not ones forced upon me. For the first time in years, I felt free, not from work or effort, but from the weight of constantly being overlooked and dismissed by the people who were supposed to love me most. My professors continued to be incredibly supportive, and one even helped me secure a consulting project with a prominent firm. It was a huge opportunity, and I poured myself into it, earning praise from the firm's leadership. At the same time, Mr. Harper stayed true to his word, keeping in touch regularly and even setting up a meeting for me with his company's CEO. "When you're ready, we'll be waiting for you," he said during our last call. His belief in me was something I no longer questioned. It had become a foundation I could lean on. Daniel, too, remained a constant presence. He'd gone from being my unofficial champion to someone I considered a second father. During one of our dinners, he surprised me by bringing out a folder filled with old letters from my grandparents. "I found these in a box when I was cleaning out my office," he said. "I thought you might like to read them." The letters were filled with stories and advice, much like the ones my grandmother used to send me. In one, my grandfather wrote, "We see the spark in you, a quiet strength that will carry you far. Always remember, your worth isn't defined by others' recognition, but by the way you carry yourself when no one is watching." Reading those words felt like a hug from the past, a reminder that they had always seen me for who I truly was. Meanwhile, my parents' lives had settled into a bleak monotony. The small apartment they now called home was a stark contrast to the house they'd once inherited. My mom, who had once thrived on social connections, rarely left the apartment, and my dad spent most of his days sitting alone in a diner, staring into his coffee. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, their relationship with Vanessa was strained at best. She had moved out, and while she occasionally called them, the blame game between them had left little room for reconciliation. Vanessa, for her part, had managed to find a part-time job in retail. It wasn't the career she'd envisioned, and from what I understood, she was struggling to rebuild her life. She hadn't contacted me since her last bitter email, and I didn't expect she ever would. Despite the distance I had created between us, there were moments when I thought about reaching out. The loss of my family still hurt, even if I had made peace with it. But every time the thought crossed my mind, I remembered the way they had dismissed me, laughed at me, and treated my future as disposable. Their actions had consequences, and those consequences weren't mine to fix. The final hearing for the case brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. My parents, now represented by yet another lawyer, tried to appeal the punitive damages, arguing that the financial burden was excessive. The judge didn't budge, reiterating that their actions had been deliberate and deceitful. She reminded them that this was not just about money, but about the violation of trust. As she spoke, I noticed my mom's shoulders sag, her head bowed low. My dad stared at the table in front of him, his expression blank. When the hearing ended, I walked out of the courtroom without looking back. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to fight for. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. The day I graduated from my MBA program, I felt a wave of emotions I hadn't prepared for. Pride, of course, for what I had accomplished, but also an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for my grandparents, who had believed in me enough to plan for my future. Gratitude for Daniel, who had stepped in when no one else would. Gratitude for myself, for finding the strength to fight for what I deserved, even when it felt impossible. As I walked across the stage to accept my diploma, I thought about what my grandparents might have said if they had been there. I imagined my grandmother's soft smile, my grandfather's firm handshake. In that moment, I felt their presence more than ever, and it was enough. The life I was building felt like a tribute to them. I had accepted a position with a major company, thanks to Mr. Harper's recommendation, and Daniel had already started discussing investment opportunities with me. The future was open and full of promise, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to step into it. My parents and Vanessa would always be a part of my story, but they no longer defined it. Their choices had shaped my path in ways I hadn't expected, but they had also shown me the strength I didn't know I had. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they had only made me stronger. As I settled into my new life, I often returned to one thought. My grandparents had been right. Education, resilience, and integrity were things no one could take away. And now, I was living proof of that truth.